Hi, everybody. It's MattHawes of The Happy Show and of Comics Unlimited in Evansville, Indiana. And I'm making this special video as a response to my buddy Larry. I got his video on the screen here for a comic book ages video that he did. I want to discuss quite a bit that he brought up. I wasn't sure how much I was going to discuss, but as I watched the video, there were certain other points that he made that I either wanted to clarify about that because Larry, he has a good grasp of the history and stuff, but there's certain things I still want to address and kind of explain about that happened during certain periods, and just also give my own opinion and commentary on some of these ages, as well as my own experiences into the video. So I'm going to try to keep this. First off, as I've been doing for previous vlogs, I don't plan to edit this video, so hopefully it won't come off as too much rambling. But also, I'm trying to maintain it and keep it under a certain time limit as it is. But I do got a lot I want to address, so I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as I can while still touching on the stuff I plan to touch on. Now, I will say, just as a little aside here, that back in the early days of YouTube, bringing that subject up again as I have in previous videos, I this would the thing I miss about making a video response about this. Back in those days, you could have made a video response like this, and it would show kind of like as a thumbnail underneath the video that the main video you were responding to, so that people could easily go back and forth between the videos. That's just my little side I want to make because I'm kind of bummed that there's no real way that YouTube allows for that anymore. I don't know why it was ever done away with. I don't know if it was a complication at the time with the technology for why they decided not that it wasn't feasible. Because I thought it was a nice idea. You could even have a whole row of thumbnails because hundreds of people could respond to a video and such, and it made it more of a sense of community. Anyway, that's not what the video is about YouTube and its changes. So I just want to just kind of put that mention in there and then go back to actually addressing points in Larry's video, making myself comfortable here. And so what I'm going to discuss first is about the comics code because he delves into the ages, and I want to speak to that as well. But in particular, I want to speak about the comics code at first because he was mentioning about the book Seduction of the Innocent and how the comics code came to be. And I would say that the comics code, he figured it was a major factor, which of course, it definitely was a major factor, if not the major factor that finally led to the Congress investigating the comic book industry for for being the cause of juvenile delinquency. See, to get understanding of if you're not a comic book fan, or if you are a comic book fan but don't have an actual working knowledge or just a cursory knowledge of the history of the industry itself, by the 1950s, comics were actually hugely popular. They're the 40s and 50s. Okay, they start to wane, partly because of stuff that happened here in the mid 50s, where I'm getting ready to talk about. But it was the entertainment industry for youth of a certain age, especially. It was there was always some publications written towards a more sophisticated older audience, but since it was seen as the thing that the youth was into, of course, for some reason, with culture, pop culture, and with the society, anything a youth group is into that becomes really a big success, it seems like there's always a group that wants to tear it down and censor it. And if you think about it, you'll realize there are the different ages. Now, I know there's certain things that happened before the 1950s that even would appeal or apply to this, though the thought of a teenager and the youth culture really didn't come into being until the 50s in a societal sense, really, either. And comic books were one of the first that got dinged by this because I always relate it to especially particularly a modern audience to understand this. I compare it to the video game industry and how that got congressional pressure, but ultimately it was an industry that decided that it needed to regulate itself. And that's because Congress usually stopped short, as they did in the 1950s, of actually laying down the law literally on comics or whatever the mass market entertainment is that's applied to youth, because it'd be considered censorship, literally censorship. And so it's usually stopped short. It takes a lot for it to go to that next step. But meanwhile, it usually shakes up the industry in its wake because the companies are worried because they don't know Will Congress actually take that next step? So they take the step themselves of self-regulation and such, which leads to, in the 50s, in the Comics Code, with video games, the rating systems. And movies and such the same way. In fact, movies, there's a thing that it wasn't necessarily youth culture, it was all culture, but in the 30s, there was a lot of pressure in the late 20s and 30s. There's a lot of pressure from the beginning of the movies, even very beginning of the movies, about how they were corrupting, society and all that. It's really interesting there too. But that's on their template for the comic book industry, whereas the comic book is a template for the video game industry about, the censorship issues and all that. So, there was an issue where the film industry itself had a code that started in 1933, 34, right in there. I think it's 33. And there's pre-code movies that are of a certain ilk. Again, a lot of these times when censorship gets involved, whether it's self-censorship or governmental censorship, there's a lot of things you pay attention to that are similar, because there was a lot of restrictions and a lot of jokes and stuff in movies, or a lot of references in movies that was not allowed in 1933 onward, or 34 onward. Like I said, I think it was enacted sometime in 33. So 33 is like the demarcation mark or whatever, as I use that word right. But anyway, it's the point where, So in the early 30s and in the 20s and stuff, there's certain little jokes that you can make about sex and everything else. If you ever wonder why are those 30s and 40s and 50s movies so pure? Because just like the comic books, why were the comic books, they weren't allowed to say certain things or do certain things, is because of this censorship. Because people, there's always been the people who want to take over what other people should be watching or something. And again, I gotta watch myself on the time of this video, because I do want to address these other points. So I could go into a whole thing just on censorship and all that stuff, of course. Let's go ahead and bring it back to comics, except for to say that I want to kind of also tell you, if you look at it, about talking about how the beat keeps going on, only it just changes industry. In the 50s, you had the comics. Like I said, you had the movies in the 30s that they were particularly going up against. And they've always continued to go against movies and other stuff, too. They don't normally always, if the thing endures, there's still censorship groups that want to still continue to more censorship. But anyway, the 50s comics, and then by late 50s, it was rock and roll. Rock and roll became the new thing. So they started attacking rock and roll. Then heavy metal music in the 80s. And then video games. So if you notice the progression, heavy metal music is rock and roll too, but it got to another point with hearings with Congress and with ratings and blah blah blah. So you see the pattern going there. And so comic books was just one of the early forms of this. And no, the government did not create the comics code. That was put on by the industry itself. Let me look again, because off the top of my head, sometimes I'm old now, so sometimes my memory is a little off. But yeah, the Comic Magazine Association of America was the ones to regulate the code. Now, here's a little key thing about that, is that, as I recall, I couldn't find in a quick search all the people involved or what have you with the formation of that group. But if I recall, Archie Comics, the owner of Archie Comics, he had a position in that company, and so did some other people from other publishers. This is a key thing to note, because William Gaines himself from EC Comics, and people like Frank Miller to this day believe, and I kind of see this, that some of what seemed to be what Larry called arbitrary rules were actually, all these rules have specific cause that the code enforced onto the industry. And a lot of people, William Gaines and Frank Miller, like I said, among them, seem to think that a lot of these were just to also push the EC out of the business, because EC was, it was aimed towards a more sophisticated audience, but it was also taking up a good amount of sales in those days. So the other publishers, they saw this as also a chance to get rid of one of their competitors, to be blunt. And that's the speculation. But it sounds speculation if you look at some of the rules that were put in place, because some sound sensible. If you think from a censorship standpoint, it sounds sensible, or at least more logical, that they would say this thing or that thing. But then a few others you're thinking, well, why are they going quite that far, that ridiculous? Because it's centered, like, and to give you an example what I'm talking about, to find the specific terms: crime, horror, and terror. They forbid the words. They didn't strictly speak. This article I looked up really quick. It doesn't get into specifics. It says they forbid those terms. They didn't forbid those terms. Let's correct that to begin with. They weren't going to forbid the word crime. What they forbid, though, and this is why it affects EC, is on the cover. It couldn't be so much of a size and all that. Like, crime does not pay, in tiny words. But crime being huge letters, or terror, or horror and stuff. They said you cannot have that like this large or whatever, because you basically cannot be marketing it as towards audience. So you weren't allowed to use those terms as marketing, basically, in a sense. And now it wasn't written as such that you couldn't do it as marketing, but it was said they could be a certain size, but that's what it was about. They didn't want like the words terror to pop out on the stand, and because they knew that was trying to get the audience to buy it, because, well, it was a horror magazine. They pretty much crippled the whole horror magazine, so it became mystery magazines or whatever, monster magazines, really, most of it. As in, like Marvel monsters, like Godzilla type or King Kong type of characters, and got away from more of a creepier, supernatural and slasher type stuff. The comic code, like I said, was enacted by the Comics Magazine. I'm going blank already on the name again. Comics Magazine Association of America, and it was self-regulation, but it wasn't just because like a book like Seduction of the Innocent came out and was bad-mouthing them or whatever, or claiming that they were responsible for juvenile delinquency. It was also, that's a great factor. Like I said, in fact, Wortham's book is a major factor in that. But this started in the 40s. It started almost from the time comics really were first published. There was always critics, blaming it for, the corruption of the minors and kids and all this. And it just became the scapegoat, like I said. Like each era has its scapegoat for mass entertainment to the youth. And so what happened was it went I was going to mention Frederick Wortham and others did magazine articles and such before he wrote his book. That was in women's magazines and parents' magazines and stuff. This was a long-term thing. It didn't just start in 1954 and in 1955 or what have you. It was a long-term building. In 1948, there was a little star symbol that you might see on some old comics from the era. That's basically an early form of the comics code, but not strictly speaking. The comics code wasn't put on by the same people, mostly, but the industry was still trying to regulate itself. But that didn't really have any teeth, and it didn't really get rid of the critics and all that. So anyway, like I said, they enacted that code in the 50s, and they made it like you couldn't see exit wounds if somebody was getting shot, and then being shot, they had to be certain, it had to be addressed, usually probably off panel more than anything. You couldn't show somebody actually getting shot on panel, and different things like that. There was different regulations, and the supernatural stories like werewolves, vampires, and all that was affected because EC's bread and butter was that. But I mean, they weren't the only ones. There was plenty of other magazine companies doing horror magazines. But the youth, basically the youth was eating up, so to speak, the horror magazines, horror comics, and the crime comics. So those were the ones targeted the most. They weren't by far the only ones targeted, but that was predominantly what was being targeted. That's why crime and horror comics more or less came to an end until the revision of the code in 1971. There was a revision of the code because they looked at it and realized, okay, a lot of these codes are antiqued. And they did that because of the two stories really in mind, which was the Spider-Man anti-drug story that actually didn't have the code. The first major publisher, I think, did not have the code, notwithstanding Dale and Gold Key, who never had the comics code because, as they said in their pledge to the parents in each one of their magazines throughout the late 50s, they're too wholesome, and they've always been wholesome, that they don't need that code. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what they were saying. So Dale and Gold Key, if you ever wonder why they never had the comics code, it's because like I said, they had their pledge to the parents saying, "Hey, dudes, we're fine. Don't worry about us. You know us, right? We were Disney companies, or not. They weren't owned by this, but they published the Disney comics and everything. So, and they did a lot of other more wholesome fare to begin with, and so they didn't feel they needed to subject themselves to the code, because there's another thing too. You have to pay as a publisher to be part of the code. See, boy, this video almost might be nothing. Let's see what time here. I want to address the ages stuff that he talked about too, about the different ages of comics in Larry's video. But there is a lot to talk about here. So, but like with the code, it started pressure because retailers were afraid to carry the magazine, because parents were making uproar because of these articles and such about that. So it was economic pressure at more than really congressional pressure that brought on the comics code, because the companies, of course, didn't want to lose sales, and retailers back then, there wasn't comic shops in the 1950s. There were not comic shops. They didn't exist. They started, in some period in the 60s, and didn't really come to prominence till the late 70s, early 80s. But by the 50s, there was no such thing as comic shops. So retailers were newsstand markets, grocery stores, and all that. So they did not make their real money off of comic books. So they could easily just get rid of those comic books. And that's what the comic book industry is, of course, realized. It's like, well, we don't want our retailers pissed at us. So they went ahead and they adopted that code and such. Anyway, I think I addressed enough about some of the elements I wanted to address about the code in Larry's video. Okay, see how much time I had. So that probably took about half of the video here. But I'm trying to go through, like I said, the other stuff quickly too. Now, before I get to the ages, I did want to address something else that Larry said, and it can be addressed within the discussion of the ages. But I just want to discuss it and get it out of the way, make sure I have enough time to discuss it. I opened my brick and mortar comic book shop in 1996, and I was a buyer, collector from childhood through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and on. I was going to say onward, but actually once I become a dealer, I stopped being a collector. So I have a good memory on some of that stuff going on, because I opened during that period as a shop. Never mind the fact that I was an active collector and stuff of the era. And I've always, since childhood, read up on industry stuff, not just the stories and the art itself. I read interviews and such, of course, with creators and such, and publications. But I also read up about what they discussed about the industry, like the comics code and everything. So this is stuff I've known about since childhood. I might be rusty on my memory, like I said, I have to look up, that's the Comics Magazine Association, but I remember it was the industry group that policed itself, and that sort of thing. But this is stuff I've known about for years, so I bring this up too, as I've got a lot of personal experience with the mid '90s era, and Larry, he suggests that the market that was still in the midst of the speculator boom during '96, and if there's a website that says that, I don't know, Larry, if you heard that or whatever, but no, it was gone by that. It wasn't totally gone. Speculators, in fact, the industry fooled itself thinking speculators gone for a while. And speculators have never been totally gone since there was a reason to speculate on comics. It just, but the boom happened in the early '90s, and yes, the comic boom, because Larry, I think, was kind of taken by surprise that it goes back as far as '85, and that's roughly true. '84, '85 is roughly true. The early new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that's one of the early speculated books, when they were, its #1 run, especially, a lot of people forget this. I wish to God I could find an article on this. If anybody else finds an article on this, please share it with me. But I specifically remember during the actual time it was happening, that one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the #1 of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, its shipment, there was a Diamond Comics, back then there was more than one distributor in the early '80s, but one of the distributors, there was a large shipment that got destroyed of the run, and it was for #1. So, and that created a buzz beyond just the amusement of the characters and the title, because this was the comic came out before the cartoons, so it was a parody. Again, I could make a whole video about this, but it was a parody of Daredevil, X-Men, and other things. We'll get into that maybe some other time. But my point is, that created a buzz, plus the black and white boom. There was a black and white boom in the 80s for black and white comics, believe it or not, alternative comics. All that was roughly the speculation, the beginning of that speculation that led to the early 90s. It evolved as it went along. And then you had John Byrne doing Superman, doing one of the first variant covers for Man of Steel #1, and all this that led into that era of speculation. The 1994 is actually more accurate on the year when the industry busted, not 96. Again, a very personal experience here. I opened in 96 knowing that the market busted, because but I knew, again, reading about comic books, I was a young man of 26 or whatever I was when I opened the shop, and I had enough knowledge. I knew this thing's in cycles. I was like, okay, yeah, we had a bust. That boom was not a common thing, but the market itself, it had the 50s market because of the cold and all that stuff, but also the event of rock and roll TV, number of other reasons. Comic book market slumped by the late 50s. The comics code definitely didn't help. Boomed back up a bit through the 60s because of Marvel, that event Marvel. It started to go back up and all in the 70s. Never to the heights, and to be honest with you, it will never be to the heights again of the 1940s and early 50s. That's when it was a mass market thing. Back then you didn't have TV, you had television. You didn't have TV. You had radio and the movies. And so for a kid to have something to look at home, that's, the comic books were the thing. That's one of the reasons that they became so prominent as a form of entertainment especially for youth, is because it was either that or listening to the radio at home, or go outside and play stickball, which some people would say, well, you probably should do that anyway. So basically, where am I getting off on this tangent? So the cycles. So like I said, the industry from its inception had went through cycles, because in the 70s there was the slump. In the 70s there was the DC implosion and everything else. Then in the 80s it started with Marvel again, with Secret Wars and all these other titles, and John Byrne, like the X-Men and stuff and all that. Basically, all start to go back up, and then up again, not to the height of the 40s, but it got to but here's the difference too. The 40s, one book equaled one kid's sale, or one adult sale too. I mean, there was always adults and kids both buying this stuff. By the 1990s, 80s, and 90s, one book's sales records, one title, I should say, one title sales records didn't necessarily represent one person, one book. One person might have bought 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 books. So you might see a sale of 1 million copies, like on X-Men #1 in 1991 by, I think it was 91, right? By Jim Lee. And that wasn't 1 million people. That's another thing that gave a false sense of inflation on how many people was really buying these books. Because you had several people speculating, not to count the fact there was variant covers on top of it that was counting to those numbers. So it's like, did the market really have that many more people in it at the time? It had some more people in it, because there was pure speculators that entered the market who just were buying comics, but those numbers aren't actually representative of the number of buyers. Whereas earlier numbers, sales records, you can be pretty sure if it said 500,000, it was probably 500,000 people that bought it. Maybe, there's you can argue about different variations on why the numbers might not be exactly right, but it was closer to it then than in the early 90s. So anyway, I'm getting to the bust. So when I opened in 96, the bust had already happened. It definitely had already happened. And so I was opening, knowing I was going against the odds of opening against two established shops in my city. And we hadn't climbed out of that slump yet. We were still in that mid-90s slump. It only been a year or two since it happened. Marvel's bankruptcy, also I want to address this. I might have to make this two-part. I keep looking at the time. Marvel's bankruptcy was not strictly due to the slump of the speculator market. It was due to the overreaching of Ron Perlman, not to be confused with an actor named Ron Perlman, but who played in Beauty and the Beast TV show and other things. that you guys might know him from. Ron Perlman, the businessman who owned Revlon Company, who bought Marvel in the 90s, in the earlier part of the 90s, who wanted to make, basically, ironically, he wanted to make Marvel like Disney-like overnight. Well, he had a lot of money, but he still didn't have Disney's like stature, and Marvel definitely, it's the working capital for the publisher itself and stuff was not like Marvel level money. I mean Disney. I'm sorry, Disney level money. And like I said, we're talking a good decade before Disney actually bought the company. And he went to make a theme park. There was going to be a Marvel theme park. He also screwed up. This is predominant. It's again not the speculator boom, because this happened after the speculator boom, but probably with finances that they still had from the speculator boom. They were wanting to make their own distributor, so they bought a regional distributor called Heroes World. Okay, Heroes World was only really on the East Coast, as I understand it. And back in these days, this was when there was several distributors. When I opened, okay, we talked about Diamond and Monopoly with Diamond. When I opened with that shop, okay, I had 3 distributors to go through, but only one was really strong, Diamond, okay, because of what happened here, and it's all Marvel's fault. I'm sorry, but it is. I love Marvel. I love the Marvel, characters and stuff, and I love a lot of stuff with the history. But it was Revlon's, Ron Perlman's, Marvel's whole point that kind of derailed things with the distribution system in the 90s. And I was there as a shop when this happened. And what happened is that Revlon's, the owner of Marvel wanted to do all these things to make Marvel bigger. And this was during the period where it was at a slump. And he took that regional distributor, which was a shot heard around the industry, and turned it into Marvel's sole distribution. Because people speculate that's what they were going to do, was take Heroes World, and Marvel was the top dog, at that point in the industry. So a lot of people were like, oh my God, they're going to make it where it's only, these distributors especially, were worried like, oh my God, this is going to kill our distribution and all this, because Marvel's going to take over. And DC was still a big company, of course. It's always been, a big company at times, between Marvel, they went neck and neck. But at this point, a lot of people were worried, and Marvel's like, nah, Heroes World, we're going to continue to be, we're going to distribute other titles too, and they try to turn this national overnight, basically, and all that. And then, of course, no, they jettisoned other companies and said, if you want Marvel, and they took Marvel out of other distributors, and said, no, you want Marvel, you come to Heroes World, otherwise you don't get Marvel. So I had to deal with Heroes World, because when I opened that was the game. You had to deal with Heroes World. Then you had to deal with either Diamond or Capital or some other smaller distributor if you wanted to get the other companies, but you couldn't. If you wanted to get DC, you had to deal with Diamond. Why? Because Diamond, Dark Horse, and Image, the other 3 largest companies, as a reaction to Marvel's deal with Heroes World, signed exclusive agreements to Diamond Comics Distributor, giving Diamond Comic Distributor an unfair advantage, of course, over Capital and all them and such. So basically what happened was Capital folded. Within the first year I opened my shop, I got a call. Let me rephrase it. I called to report some problems with my shipment or whatever to Capital. They answered the phone, Diamond Comics. I was like, what? I called the wrong number? They're like, no, we were bought this morning. so then there were 2. And then Marvel then they filed Chapter 13 bankruptcy. They filed form bankruptcy where they're not out of business. It's more bankruptcy protection, okay? And meanwhile, during the same time, it wasn't during the same time. It was right after this period, because this led to the next thing that I was going to say. Then Marvel's too big to fall, in the sense, if it fell, the whole industry, to be honest, would fall. But so what it did is Marvel went back kind of almost with tails between its legs to Diamond. I say almost because it still had enough clout, because it still was Marvel, they could say, well, we want a separate catalog from your primary catalog and all this. But they did go back to Diamond because they had no other choice. And Diamond, of course, wasn't going to reject Marvel. So they said they made concessions like, okay, we'll have your separate catalog. So if you ever were a person who bought the Diamond catalog throughout the 90s on for several years after through 2000s and wonder why Marvel had its own catalog, it's because Marvel brokered that deal so it could have more prominence in other companies, which I'm sure DC loved. And anyway, so you basically had that happen. And then once Marvel was back into the fold, then Diamond Comic Distributors became effectively a monopoly. Effectively, I say, or virtually a monopoly. Literally a monopoly, it's tricky because there's other companies that could have distribution. I mean, there's other distribution companies that could still distribute comics, arguably. But anybody who's in the comic industry knows that when Marvel, at this point now Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and Image, all those companies from the late 90s onward through the 2000s had exclusive agreements through Diamond, you've got a monopoly. Anybody else anybody in the comic book industry as a fan or anybody, if you got those in your pocket, you've got a monopoly. Who cares about the other companies? That sounds harsh to say. There's a lot of great stuff, but what I'm saying is from a financial standpoint. I'm not saying from a critical about the product being made. I'm saying from a logical business financial standpoint, you have a monopoly. And yes, Diamond has a history. Larry, you gotta ask a lot of those retailers about this. They've got a history of sending damaged books, trust me. They've got and you can't just hinge, even if they were immaculate, perfectly beautiful shipments, you can't hinge on whether or not it's a good thing or bad thing that they have a monopoly just based on how they pack the books. There's a lot more involved in that, especially when you're the retailer dealing with them. It's like, no, and for the fans too, fans may not realize it, it's to your benefit. Your benefit as fans, benefits as retailers or dealers, that Diamond does not have that monopoly. And I'm so glad that monopoly is broken. And I am, as you can see, passionate in the way I'm discussing this. No, you do not want them to have a monopoly. Trust me. We've been stranglehold. There's a lot of things that could have been better through these years. I know it's at this point just speculation that it would have been because there's no way to prove it. But trust me, it's never good to have that strong a monopoly in the industry. I realize right now that I'm not going to make it through this video enough to talk to ages, so my next video I will discuss the actual ages and get to that, because there's interesting discussion. It's just Larry brought up so much for me to discuss with you guys and with him, and kind of as a response to his video about these sort of things. But yeah, Diamond, it's very good that they're not Monopoly anymore, and it's too little too late almost, though, is what's sad. But no, I had lots of damaged books over the years, Larry. Diamond does not immaculately ship these things. But that's why I let the comment like, well, let me discuss this in my video, because but I understand, like, you're not retailers, so if you're not privy to a lot of this, and I don't know what these other companies ship their stuff like, and how much it compares to Diamond, because admittedly I don't have a brick and mortar shop anymore. I closed it in 2014, and this delusion or whatever, I'm trying to think of the word, dissolvement or whatever of Diamond Comics as the monopoly it was. Due to, a lot of stuff due to online sales and stuff like that led to their having to break that up. Anyway, I don't deal with the new publishers because I don't have the company since a brick and mortar shop since, and I still continuously sell and all that, but I don't deal with the distributors. But I do keep a little bit of an eye and ear on that, because again, as a fan as well as a dealer, I keep up on industry stuff as much as I can. So no, I can't compare how they package their stuff as opposed to, like, the new distributor as opposed to Diamond. But again, I'll just say one last time, yeah, Diamond did not have an immaculate record. No. And what's worse, and the reason why I also say this with such passion is not just because it's damaged, but especially when you're a small distributor, not distributor, I was a retailer, excuse me. When you're a small retailer ordering from such a distributor, and they have monopoly, you don't really have much odds or much. You don't have many options once they keep sending you damaged books or losing your books or shortening your books, not sending you everything you're supposed to get and all this, who are you going to turn to? Nobody, because they have a monopoly. So again, very good that they no longer have monopoly. I would burn their effigy, a diamond thing if I could, just to say, yeah, down with. No, that sounds harsh, but what I'm saying is they weren't very beloved by a lot of us retailers because, with like a lot of people who have a monopoly, when they realize that they basically give you a go screw you attitude to things. Maybe not publicly, they keep up the the diplomatic thing for the public, but trust me, anyway. Enough ranting about that. Sorry for the rant, but that's something I just wanted to say, because let's not cast these guys as like good guys, but also let's not cast them as villains. All right, because they weren't villains in the strictest sense; they were just greedy businessmen. But they were trying to make money and all that stuff, and for them, it made sense, of course, to own the distribution of every major comic company, so I can't blame them for, of course, doing that. They're smart on them. In fact, I don't blame them for that. I mean, they're going to do what they're going to do. They're going to try to make as much money as they can. The ones I blame was Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, Image, especially when they got to a point, even after the market started to rebound again in the 2000s and be healthier and all, that they kept those exclusive agreements. That Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and Image kept those exclusive agreements is what made it harder for the industry, to get fair practices with the distributor. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and end this before it cuts me off. And like I said, I'm going to address the ages thing in another video. But Larry, thanks for giving me this chance to discuss this. Hopefully, I'll come off too impassioned, but I just wanted to point out some things and because it was your video. It was a fun springboard to discuss a lot of this stuff that I had thought about discussing in the past. Anyway, I am going to get cut off, so I'm going to go ahead and say, see you in the next video, and I will get to those ages. Yay!